Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined for a second time by Dr. Allan Horwitz. He is Board of Governors Professor Emeritus of Sociology at Rutgers University, and today we're going to talk about his latest book, DSM, A History of Psychiatry's Bible. So, Dr. Horwitz, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on again.
Oh, well, it's a great pleasure to be on again with you, Ricardo.
Okay, so tell us perhaps a little bit about what you think people should need to know, or the main things people should need to know about the history of the development of psychiatry and how it became sort of a cultural phenomenon for people then to be able to understand how the DSM came about.
Mhm. Yeah, well, psychiatry really became a major cultural phenomenon in different times in different places. That is, certainly it probably really emerged in Europe and with Freud's work, which became enormously popular really in the teens and especially in the 1920s and early 1930s until the European analysts were really forced to emigrate to the United States. It took longer to gain popularity, in the U.S. But really after the Second World War, especially in the 1950s, early 1960s, it became enormously popular in the United States, and particularly in its psychoanalytic version, and really has maintained a very visible cultural presence, although in a very revised form. And I think the DSM, the Diagnostic Manual, is really at the heart of its current popularity.
Mm-hmm. And when did psychiatric diagnoses first appear? Because that's really the crux of what we're talking about here.
Yeah, well, diagnoses first appeared in a very limited sense in the 19th century, and they were mainly confined to only the most serious kinds of conditions, such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, the sorts of things that patients would have in hospitalized settings. That in the United States, the first diagnostic manual appeared in 1921. It had 22 different categories, 21 of which were psychotic conditions, because it was really meant for use in asylums, within institutions. And one category sort of covered all of the neuroses. So that was one very early predecessor of the DSM. The immediate predecessor would have been a manual that was developed by U.S. Army psychiatrists in World War II, who found really two major things. First, that a very high proportion of soldiers in combat were suffering psychiatric breakdowns. And the second thing was that the kinds of breakdowns they had, which were clearly a response to their incredibly stressful experiences, just weren't encompassed by the existing manual, which was meant to deal with inpatients. So they really they created a brand new manual that in many ways strongly resembles the first DSM. This was published in 1946, the year after the war ended, and really served as the model for the first DSM, which was published in 1952. And that manual sort of combined two major sorts of influences. The first was an emigre psychiatrist, Adolf Meyer, who really emphasized how most mental illnesses were a combination of inborn predispositions and of environmental factors. So it was people who were responding to their circumstances. So the environment was a very important aspect. And so in addition to Meyer's influence, Sigmund Freud's notions that you have neurotic illnesses, and that anxiety is really sort of at the heart of a whole wide spectrum of different neurotic conditions. So that influence focused on very, very general underlying processes rather than outward symptoms. So the DSM-1 and the DSM-2, which came 16 years later in 1968, really didn't pay a lot of attention to sort of the overt symptoms of some condition. They were much more general in their outlook, but they sufficed in the 50s and the 60s because nobody cared much about diagnoses. They weren't, most therapy was not paid for by insurance, that there was very little regulations over, what drug companies could advertise their products for. The federal government really had very little concern with diagnoses. So the DSM-1 and DSM-2 were perfectly satisfactory manuals for that period of time when diagnosis just was not very important.
Mm-hmm. So what would you say led to the development of those early psychiatric diagnoses? I mean, of course, one does not necessarily exclude the other, but was it primarily science, scientific developments, and the scientific understanding of mental disorder or any other psychological category? Or was it driven mainly by, for example, politics, legal issues related to welfare and insurance and stuff like that?
Well, it's really both. That a variety of factors kind of converge to make a symptom-based manual with lots of diagnoses almost inevitable. The first, had to do with the research psychiatrists who really barely existed before the 1960s. And they came to be quite a powerful group within psychiatry. And as researchers, they needed measurable kinds of conditions. The DSM-1 and DSM-2 were really not very clear. They could be sort of operationalized in many different ways. If you're a researcher who's trying to measure mental illness, they were clearly inadequate manuals. So you have a research community that's getting more and more powerful and that needs specific diagnoses. So that's one factor. A second factor had to do with the pharmaceutical industry, and which really starts developing into a very potent societal force in the 1950s, where their products were sort of marketed for very, very general conditions and not particular sorts of diagnoses. That changed in the early 1970s when the Food and Drug Administration, which in the United States regulates the marketing and promotion of all drugs, said they could no longer advertise their products for the stress of life, which was a very common marketing technique at the time. They had to prove effectiveness with particular kinds of conditions, like depression or anxiety or some concrete measurable issue. So that really turned the pharmaceutical companies into needing very particular diagnoses that they didn't find in the existing DSM-1 and DSM-2. A third force, which you also mentioned earlier, had to do with third-party health insurance, where, at least in the United States, the government at the time didn't pay for mental health care. And in the 50s, most patients paid out of pocket for therapists. That third-party health insurance really starts to grow and flourish in the 1960s. And insurers really also, I mean, if you have people saying, well, I'm just stressed out, or, you know, my kids are having problems and that makes me, feel bad, well, that's not really going to cut it as a reimbursable kind of condition. So the insurers are also looking at more particular diagnoses. So those were three potent forces: the psychiatric researchers, the drug companies, and the insurance companies. All are sort of clamoring for a much more specific kind of diagnostic manual.
And were the researchers in particular in conflict with the medical practitioners, for example?
Yeah, well, probably the most well-known was Robert Spitzer, who went on to become the major designer of the DSM-3, which was really the revolution in psychiatric diagnoses. There were, a number of others, mainly connected with two institutions in the United States. One was Washington University of St. Louis, which was a sort of anti-psychoanalytic outpost of really medical-minded thinking, saying, well, psychiatric diagnoses should be comparable to medical diagnoses. Samuel Goose and Eli Robbins would have been the two major figures connected with the Washington University group. And the second major group was at Columbia University, which is where Spitzer was. Donald Klein was another very influential psychiatrist affiliated with Columbia, and also a major drug researcher. So those are a few of the major figures.
Mm-hmm. And how did the way people think about mental disorders change with the advent of the DSM?
Mm-hmm. Well, prior to the DSM-3, people really talked about such general entities as were well-known neuroses, psychoses, but not really particular specific diagnoses. After the DSM-3, things like major depressive disorder, social anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, attention deficit disorder. I mean, you have, for the first time, really very particular diagnoses coming into broad cultural consciousness and really become a part of most everyday conversation.
Mm-hmm. And what shaped and shapes still in the DSM-5 now, and probably in the future in the DSM-6, the criteria associated with each diagnosis? I mean, how are they developed?
Yeah, for the most part, I mean, say the current DSM-5 is remarkably similar to the DSM-3. I mean, there are changes in particular criteria, but there have really been no major changes in the DSM since 1980, when the DSM-3 came out, which is not to say psychiatrists haven't tried to make major changes. And certainly in the lead up to the DSM-5, this would have been in the first decade, in the first 12 or 13 years of the 21st century, where researchers who had been, sort of the major proponents of the DSM-3 came to realize that the whole system just wasn't very good. It was actually very misleading, that it was based on the notion that you have several hundred different distinct psychiatric diagnoses, whereas in fact what they're finding is really there's a very small number of much more general kinds of conditions. So they attempted to make a thoroughgoing change in the manual, and almost completely, unlike in 1980, where they succeeded in implementing the DSM-3, they completely failed to try and change the DSM-3 in the proceedings of the DSM-5. Mm-hmm. And so the result now is the current manual, the DSM-5, is really, nobody thinks it's especially good, but it is especially necessary, and particularly for clinicians who, for the most part, depend on third-party payments. They need to put some specific diagnoses to get reimbursed. I mean, this is in the United States. I mean, the situation is different in other countries. So clinicians fought the attempt to change the DSM quite fiercely and were successful. And so the manual we have now is substantially the same as the DSM-3 in 1980.
Mm-hmm. Are there any specific diagnoses or diagnostic categories you could tell us about that have been either added or removed from the DSM across its history, not for scientific reasons, but for other kinds of reasons like political reasons, reasons having to do, I mean, for example, to serve certain personal interests or something like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there have been a few examples of that. Probably the best known was in 1973, when homosexuality had been a psychiatric diagnosis in the DSM-1 and then in the DSM-2. So, and this was around the same time when a very activist gay movement had mobilized. They had a lot of publicity. They were very active at psychiatric meetings challenging the homosexuality diagnoses. They were able to have the American Psychiatric Association vote on whether homosexuality should be a mental disorder, and they voted no, it should not be, and homosexuality was removed from the manual and has not reappeared and probably never will reappear as a mental disorder. But just to show you how much things have changed in terms of the value of diagnoses, in the most recent DSM-5, gender dysphoria was a condition that a few gay activists opposed because, it's saying almost, transsexuals have mental illnesses, and that's wrong to stigmatize them in that way, making the same argument that was used against homosexuality several decades before. But in this case, the same gay advocacy organizations opposed removing gender dysphoria from the manual. And the reason wasn't that they really thought it was a mental disorder. It was that to get sexual reassignment surgery, you need to have some sort of diagnosis. And so gender dysphoria became a necessity for someone looking for sexual reassignment surgery. And again, it wasn't because anybody thought it was a mental disorder, just was a social necessity so that now you have the gay organizations opposing its removal. And so the manual does have a category of gender dysphoria for very practical reasons.
Mm-hmm. So in the book, you go through three different interpretations or possible interpretations of the DSM: scientific progress, harmful impacts, and the social perspective. Could you tell us about them and perhaps tell us if you think that any of these is more correct than the others?
Yeah, well, the first explanation is, the DSM has represented progressive scientific progress, and that I think there was a legitimate case to make that the DSM-3 in many ways was superior to the manuals that came before it. The DSM-4 made a few incremental changes, really didn't change much at all. What the problem with the scientific progress explanation came with the run-up to the DSM-5, where it's the same people who in the past had claimed that the DSM is this great movement forward are the same ones who are saying, well, it's really no good, and it's really not an accurate representation of the reality of mental illnesses. So that now the first interpretation of DSM as progress is in a very precarious state, even though you still hear the leaders of, say, the American Psychiatric Association proclaiming this. In fact, in other settings, they have almost demolished their own argument. So that is one explanation. A second is the basically the DSM psychiatric diagnoses as really harmful as instruments of social control that are used to stigmatize behaviors that mainstream people don't like. That was is certainly not a new explanation. Probably the most prominent and very well-known proponent was Thomas Szasz, who first raised this in the early 1960s, and still basically made the same argument for 40 or more years after that. And I think especially in the 1960s, in the 1970s, you did have a very vocal group proclaiming that the DSM diagnoses repress and stigmatize people. That argument was taken up by feminist opponents, saying that it's especially women who are repressed by DSM diagnoses. One of the big problems with looking at psychiatric diagnoses as instruments of social control is, for the most part, not completely, some people still resist psychiatric diagnoses, but for the most part, they are overwhelmingly popular. There's people are seeking treatment voluntarily, that mental health has now become a major positive rallying cry. Seeking therapy is no longer nearly as stigmatized as it had been decades ago. So that while to a certain extent, in occasional instances, psychiatry is used as an instrument of social control, for the most part, it's a reactive to the wishes of lay people who want psychiatric treatment. So there's, I think, major problems in both looking at the DSM as scientific progress and as an instrument of social control. Mm-hmm. Okay, the third explanation that I go through, and certainly is the one that I adhere to, is really looking at the DSM as a product of social forces, that, as looking at the social context of DSM, and you see just many different interest groups, psychiatric researchers, mental health clinicians, insurance companies, the federal government, the drug companies, that all of these influence the shaping of the DSM. And for them, diagnoses are practical necessity. So it's looking at how they influence the DSM and how they really use the diagnoses in the manual.
Mm-hmm. So if the diagnoses that were developed, created, were to serve these particular interests and purposes you mentioned earlier, can we say that they are scientifically reliable enough for us to even say that, for example, what comes out of randomized control trials and the push for more research-based empiricism is even reliable in the end? I mean, can we trust any of that?
Yeah, well, one of the major arguments for implementing the DSM-3 in 1980 was that it was a far more reliable system than the earlier DSMs had been. And for the most, that is generally true because it's much easier for different clinicians to agree, well, this person has this symptom or that symptom, as opposed to, well, this person is suffering from an underlying trauma that happened to them when they were 2 years old. So there was an argument to be made that the DSM was more reliable. In the trials that were made of the diagnoses before the DSM-5, this would have been in the early 21st century, turns out the reliability was much lower than was thought to be, and that it really was not very high. And so this, because the whole DSM system had been built on the foundation of being reliable, even if it had problems with validity, at least it should have been reliable. And now there's even some question about its reliability.
Mm-hmm. So, but do you think that in general we can scientifically trust these mental disorders as entities and how they're used in research, or not?
Well, there's really come to be quite a gap between researchers and the DSM, because the researchers now are coming to see mental illness more in terms of very broad conditions, internalizing factors such as depression and anxiety, and depression and anxiety are probably the two major conditions, but they much more often appear together, so that somebody who's depressed is also anxious, somebody who's anxious is also depressed, so that they're not that separable, so that it might make more sense to talk about internalizing conditions than externalizing conditions. Then you have things like substance use, some of the personality disorders that are marked by acting out kinds of things. So instead of internalizing problems, you externalize problems. So you have this group of conditions that are externalized as well as internalized. Well, that looking at mental illness in that way is a far cry from the close to 300 distinct diagnoses in the current DSM. So there's really now coming to be a disconnect between the way researchers study mental illness and the DSM conditions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in fact, in the book at a certain point you mentioned that it took 2 decades or almost 2 decades after the publication of DSM-3 for psychiatric researchers to recognize serious problems with the basic characteristics of mental disorders. I mean, they found out that they were virtually the opposite of those portrayed in the manual, and I'm just going to read the main ones here. They were overlapping rather than discrete, dimensional more than categorical, generalized and not specific, and reflective of a small number of basic processes as opposed to hundreds of distinct conditions. So would you like to comment on this?
That would summarize the argument. I would add one thing, that when the DSM-3 was published in 1980, genetics in a serious way was just starting to flourish. And I think the belief was, once more studies were done, once more knowledge would accumulate, that particular genes would be found to underlie various kinds of disorders. That has turned out to be almost a complete failure. And what has been found, when you look at, say, for example, schizophrenia, that an enormous number of genes are connected to it instead of a single gene. Many, many genes, each of which has a very small effect. So that the initial thinking that there was some gene that would underlie different mental disorders is now rejected as a model for genetic study. And instead, researchers are looking at how large numbers of genes are connected, each in a small way, to various conditions.
That relates to, for example, genome-wide association studies, where really hundreds and even thousands of genes get connected to particular mental conditions.
That's correct, yes.
So what changed then when we moved from DSM-3 to DSM-3R and DSM-4?
Yeah, well, DSM-3R and DSM-4, both of them were mainly just sort of working out the most obvious problems with DSM-3. Neither manual made any fundamental changes in the diagnostic system. So they really, in more ways than not, the DSM-3R and DSM-4 are extensions of the DSM-3.
But if I remember correctly, it was during this time that a specific condition, social anxiety disorder, was introduced, correct?
Yeah, and that would be one of, I think, a small number of new conditions that came about in the manual. Social anxiety disorder is especially interesting because it was almost completely the creation initially of the pharmaceutical industry, which sort of saw a potential gold mine if you can convince people that things like getting nervous before giving a talk is a sign of a mental disorder that requires taking a pill to get over your anxiety. And there was just enormous advertising campaigns around social anxiety disorder that were hugely successful. And that social anxiety disorder is perhaps the best example of the creation of a new kind of psychiatric disorder. And as you say, that happened in the DSM-3R.
So let's get now then into the DSM-5. What was it supposed to bring new to the table, and did it deliver on its promises or not?
Yeah, well, the main impetus behind DSM-5, which originally the researchers who were in charge of revising the DSM-4 wanted to do, was to make the DSM more in line with findings from research studies, which, as in the passage you had read before, is sort of indicated that mental illnesses were more overlapping than discrete, were not so much categories separate from the other categories as overlapping with each other, that were more gradations. You have a little bit or a medium amount or a lot, instead of either you have the condition or you don't. So they really wanted to change the new DSM-5 to reflect those sorts of things, making the whole system much less of various categories, each of which are seen as independent of the others. They almost completely failed in trying to do this. And the reason, a couple of reasons they did, is first of all, just psychiatrists certainly are medically trained. And in medicine, you basically, you have a condition or you don't have a condition. So there's people are just trained to think in terms of, what kind of disease does this person have? So just their whole way of thinking was sort of foreign to medically trained physicians. The second and possibly even more important reason is that clinicians may fully believe the same thing that researchers do. I mean, they see mental illnesses as overlapping, as not distinct, as dimensional and not categorical, but they have no choice but to use diagnoses. They need to say, this person has major depressive disorder. They can't say, well, they have a little bit of depression, but maybe not enough for a real diagnosis. That just doesn't allow them to function as professionals. They require diagnoses, even though many or possibly even most of them don't fully believe in the reality of the diagnosis. They do realize they need them as a practical necessity.
Mm-hmm. We've already touched on genetics a little bit, but do you think that these emphasis on a biological approach related to genetics and neuroscience primarily, basically this quest to finding biomarkers of specific mental disorders, is a scientifically sound one or not?
Yeah, well, in a very limited way. I mean, there certainly are probably some genetic contributions to many kinds of mental disorders. On the other hand, and this was really brought out very forcefully in a pretty recent book by Thomas Insel, who had been the head of the National Institute for Mental Health for many years and was really responsible for moving that agency, which was the primary sponsor of research on mental illness in the United States, in a very, very genetic direction. And what Insel's newest book says, he was wrong. I mean, he just says that turned out to be to direct the field in totally the wrong direction. And in fact, what's needed is much more attention to the kinds of services that people with serious mental illnesses have. And it's these sorts of treatments and therapies and housing being an especially prominent need. This is the direction the field ought to go, and it should really turn away from these genetically oriented studies towards more of a focus on social services.
Mm-hmm. So in the book you also mention regarding the DSM-5 how it reduces the validity of certain diagnoses, and you give the examples of major depressive disorder and substance use disorder. Could you explain that?
Yes, well, with major depression, I think when it came into the DSM-3, it had, like all of the other DSM-3 diagnoses, a list of 9 symptoms. You have to have 5 of those 9 symptoms to get a diagnosis of major depressive disorder. There is one exception to that, that if someone close to you had just died and you were grieving the death of that person, then even though you would almost expectably have, you would be sad, you might have loss of appetite, problems sleeping, it would be very easy for someone who is grieving to meet the symptom-based diagnostic criteria for major depression. So the DSM-3 put in an exception so it said, even if you have 5 symptoms for a 2-week period, which was the time period for the depressant symptoms, you won't get a diagnosis of major depressive disorder if someone close to you has just died. To get a diagnosis, first of all, your condition would have to last at least 2 months instead of 2 weeks. Still seems a little short period, 2 months, but at least it was longer than 2 weeks. Or if you had an extremely severe, if you had say a psychotic episode, or if you're hallucinating, well then if you have that sort of severe symptom, you can still get it. But most people would be exempted from the diagnosis. Well, in the DSM-5, they the committee that was charged with developing the MDD, major depressive diagnosis, got rid of the bereavement exclusion. So now it's basically saying anybody who has any 5 symptoms for a 2-week period can get the depressive diagnosis. I think any layperson would realize the invalidity of that. I mean, that it's normal to be sad after someone dies. That this was, I think, a major step backward in diagnosis. And the other thing you mentioned was the substance use disorder. I think that would be a second instance where there used to be in DSM-3 and DSM-4 2 separate categories of substance abuse, and there's one category of substance dependence, which is pretty much what it says, that people who need to make continuous use of a variety of, it could be opioids, it could be alcohol, it could be marijuana, but people who require and often increasing amounts of the substance. There was a second category of substance abuse, which really meant the social consequences of substance dependence. That is, getting arrested and going to jail, or getting drunk and oversleeping and missing your crucial exam in school the next day. So these had to do with the social consequences. What happened in DSM-5 was these 2 separate categories were put together into a single category. And actually, you need fewer symptoms rather than more symptoms to get a diagnosis now of substance use disorder. So the crazy thing about that, especially when in a country like the United States now, where you're seeing such major changes, especially in marijuana laws regarding marijuana, where now in a number of states its use is completely legal, as opposed, so you can't be arrested. So now the implication is if you drive across a state line, I mean, from a state where marijuana use is legal into one where it's illegal, you put yourself at greater risk of getting a mental illness diagnosis because of the criteria, which is completely crazy. But the merging of substance dependence with substance abuse has created this possibility of just having negative social consequences is now grounds for a mental disorder. Mm-hmm. So there's a second example where I think the DSM-5 moved backwards from earlier diagnoses.
Yeah. So, of course, the book is focused on the DSM, but do you have any opinion on the ICD? Does it suffer from the same issues or not?
I think to a much lesser extent. I'm not nearly as familiar with the ICD as with the DSM, but I think it's far less purely symptom-based than the DSM. And which is a good thing. And I am aware of the ICD just made some major changes in the personality disorders category, where now it really has become much more dimensional rather than categorical, seeing it in a much more general way, which is what the researchers who were trying to revise the DSM-5 had tried but failed to implement. The ICD successfully implemented. So if you are in favor of seeing mental illnesses as more dimensional than categorical, then you probably would like, at least in the personality disorders part, the ICD much better than the DSM.
Mm-hmm. So even with all of these problems, do you think that there are aspects of how the development of diagnostic criteria for certain mental disorders got developed across the history of the DSM that are scientifically valid, scientifically sound, that we should keep? I mean, when it comes to thinking about the future, the development of future editions of the DSM?
Yeah, well, I think there's coming to be a real disconnect between the sort of nature of what's emerging as the true nature of mental illnesses, which are very broad, very overlapping, not discrete diseases at all. With just the practical need to have discrete diseases as the basis of a diagnostic system. So there's this almost irreconcilable conflict between what the mental health professions require in their day-to-day work and what researchers need to have. And I don't know how that's going to work itself out in the future. I would say the current situation is pretty much of a mess, but if there's going to be any satisfactory resolution, I don't see the way forward.
Mm-hmm. But do you think that it still has some positive outcomes, like, for example, a widespread acceptance of people who suffer from certain mental disorders and perhaps some other positive effects that it had on culture, and also possibly the fact that it's easier for people with a particular diagnosis to get access to healthcare and insurance?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's certainly the positive impacts of the DSM have been to facilitate treatment for people who want to get treatment. I think in respect to children, there's been many positive impacts that it's now much, much easier for families to get mental health services for their kids. Although on the other hand, it's also much easier for children to get medication and possibly over medication, and for parents to be relying on medication to control their children. So it's sort of a mix that does have positive impacts, but it also carries negative impacts as well.
Mm-hmm. So generally speaking, do you think that we should keep the DSM and perhaps try to change it in a way that goes more along the lines of what the researchers are finding, or perhaps just start from scratch?
Mm-hmm. Well, in an ideal world, I think starting from scratch wouldn't be a bad idea. In the real world, that's just not going to happen. And even the kinds of reforms that researchers want, such as making conditions more dimensional rather than strict either or categories, that may also be just practically impossible. That is, the DSM serves not just research functions, but also, as noted a number of times, clinicians need it to get reimbursement, that drug companies, at least in the United States, have no choice but to advertise their products for particular conditions, even though in fact they treat a wide, they're not disorder specific at all, the popular medications. So practically speaking, I don't see major revisions coming down the pike.
Mm-hmm. So one last question then. What would you personally, as a sociologist and with what you research about diagnoses, diagnostic criteria, the DSM and so on, would suggest in terms of how should people try to change how things are done?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think just taking particular diagnoses a little less seriously would be a good thing. That I think there's really a strong tendency for people to think, well, I have post-traumatic stress disorder, or I have Asperger's syndrome, or I have major depression, and in fact you don't feel good, but maybe not using specific diagnoses as a way to interpret your experiences, I think would be a positive development. Mm-hmm. So even if psychiatry can't change the diagnostic manual for practical reasons, at least individuals can take it a little bit less seriously.
And do you think that would have a positive impact on people and how they deal with what they experience mentally?
Yeah, I do think that thinking of having problems with relationships is maybe a more positive way of dealing with a problem than saying, oh, I have anxiety disorder, or I have major depressive disorder. That going out and looking at your own circumstances and how you're dealing with people, how you're feeling generally, is a healthier way to approach your life than in looking for particular diagnoses.
Mm-hmm. So the book is again DSM, A History of Psychiatry's Bible. I will be leaving a link to it in the description box of the interview. Dr. Horwitz, thank you so much again for coming on the show, and it's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Okay, yeah, I enjoyed it, and I'll look forward to talking with you again.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing and to help me keep the channel sustainable, please visit my Patreon page or PayPal and consider making a pledge there. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share the interview, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. The show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litska, Anne Blanchett, Parago Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alec, Jonathan Wissel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollesy, Enrique Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Vos, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger, Goldstein, Dan Demetriou, Robert Windaga, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Cabana, Mark Blythe, Roberto Iguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacil Adeza Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmides, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litska, Denise Cook, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, and Todd Shackelford. My producers Cesar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafinia, Kian Gilligan, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder. And my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.